These days, buying a video game is becoming more and more of a long-term investment. Between online multiplayer, downloadable content, battle passes, and expansions, plonking down your hard-earned money for a video game is something that should pay off for years to come. But even the wisest among us have been burned by a bad investment, a game that we were sure was going to live up to all of our expectations, only to end up falling flat on its face as soon as we booted it up. Good things come to those who wait, however, and no matter how much a game may resemble a lump of coal on the outside, there can always be a real gem waiting deep within. Their mistakes may be many and varied, and the game may be downright unplayable as a result, but through persistent bug fixes, additional content, or just tearing everything down and starting over, the games on today's list proved that you can indeed polish a, poo. I'm Ben from TripleJump, and here are 10 bad games that became good eventually. Number 10. The Elder Scrolls Online. There must be some very hard-working people at Bethesda, because while they were already busy porting Skyrim to every console known to man, somehow they were able to continually support a full-scale MMORPG at the same time. Released in 2014 after 7 years of development, Elder Scrolls Online finally opened up the entire continent of Tamriel for players to explore, to an extent. The game received middling reviews from critics who compared it negatively to competitors like World of Warcraft due to its limited scope and the restrictions placed on cooperative play. Fans also bristled at the game's pricing model, which required a monthly subscription on top of a not insubstantial initial purchase. About a year after its initial release, Elder Scrolls Online was launched on consoles and rebranded as Tamriel Unlimited, which brought with it a number of fixes. Players were now more free to interact with each other, character and enemy levels had been rescaled to encourage exploration, and perhaps best of all, the mandatory subscription had been entirely ditched. Since instituting these changes, Elder Scrolls Online has received a much more positive reappraisal, and backed by a steady stream of award-winning annual expansions that continue to add even more content, it officially became Bethesda's best-performing game for 4 years straight. Not bad for a game competing against 8 dozen different versions of Skyrim. Number 9. Dead Island. Most of the time, when players lambast a game for being unfinished, it's perhaps a bit of an exaggeration in response to an unpolished product, but sometimes it is painfully literal. Dead Island was the talk of the town when it was announced, with what many heralded as the greatest video game trailer of all time, so expectations were understandably high for the game's actual release. If you got the game on PlayStation and Xbox, then aside from a few launch day bugs, everything was fine. If you got the game on Windows, however, then everything was very much not fine. Somehow, the Windows release of Dead Island launched an unfinished beta build of the game that still had developer tools featured, including disabled clipping and toggling to a third-person view. The devs worked furiously to patch the game as best they could, but there's only so many plasters you can put on something that's already dead, and the Windows port continued to suffer from numerous bugs until the release of the definitive edition in 2016 finally brought it up to snuff. The fact that a game that released in such a poor state was successful enough to eventually warrant multiple sequels is proof that the dead really can rise from their grave. Spooky. Number 8. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. In some cases, fixing a broken game is such a monumental task that the developers need to enlist a little help. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines was a good game marred by critical flaws, the ambitious scope of its gameplay and narrative hindered by serious technical issues. Long load times made the game a chore to start up, and the various graphical errors and limited AI were frequent problems for those trying to immerse themselves in the game's well-crafted story. The developers at Troika Games weren't the ones at fault, however. The game was rushed to release by its publisher, Activision. Boo! Meaning that it reached shelves in an unfinished state. Heavy hitters like Metal Gear Solid 3 and Half-Life 2 releasing on the same day hurt the sales of Bloodlines, and Troika sadly went under without ever seeing their project finished. Fortunately, fans recognized the game for the unpolished gem that it was, and built on the efforts of the developers at Troika, many of whom continued working on the game without pay to release a bevy of mods and unofficial patches to bring the game into a fully polished and working state. Today, Bloodlines is remembered as one of the greatest RPGs of its time, and it's mostly thanks to the game's loyal fan base, and no thanks at all to Activision. Number 7. Tom Clancy's The Division. Ubisoft's Tom Clancy series allows players to live out a number of high-octane, adrenaline-pumping action hero fantasies. You can be a secret agent, the pilot of a fighter jet, or a member of an elite counter-terrorist squad. Or you can be a person waiting in line to use a computer. Tom Clancy's The Division is remembered today as a fantastic online shooter and one of the best-selling games of its era, but at launch it rubbed more than a few players the wrong way. Many found the game to be barren and empty, full of repetitive missions and exploitable bugs, and it even ended up going viral due to players being forced to wait wait in line for literal hours to use an in-game laptop as part of the tutorial. Players left the Division in droves during its opening weeks, prompting the developers to promise numerous fixes and updates. Multiple planned expansions were delayed for months in order to ensure the base game was up to par, and eventually a steady stream of new content fleshed out many of the areas that players felt were most lacking. Whether you're a latecomer or someone who was wooed back after ditching the game, the revival of Tom Clancy's The Division ensures that there will be no divisions in the fanbase. Number 6. Battlefield 4. They often say that third time's the charm, but what they leave out is that sometimes the fourth time is the opposite of the charm. Fourth time's the curse, I suppose? I don't know, I'm not a wizard. Overall, the Battlefield series of shooters has been rather well liked both for its single-player campaigns and its multiplayer, with the franchise's games usually hitting the 80s and 90s on Metacritic. The first major stumbling block they encountered was the release of Battlefield 4, which was criticized for its campaign but praised for its multiplayer when it worked. That is, players around the world who purchased the game found themselves unable to enjoy it due to game-breaking bugs that made the multiplayer literally unplayable, an issue so prevalent that Polygon revised their score for the game from a 7.5 to a 4. The team at DICE acknowledged the severity of the issues and, to their credit, suspended work on any expansions for the game until they got the multiplayer working properly. It still took some time, but eventually the same players who had bought the game on day one and quit in disgust found their way back and discovered an enjoyable experience waiting for them. It may still be Battlefield 4, but it's not a 4 out of 10 anymore. Number 5. Crusader Kings 2. Crusader Kings 2 is all about long-term political control, where the end goal is not just to win at war, but to reign supreme over your opponents in terms of wealth, power, and influence. In a similar way, the developers of Crusader Kings 2 took a long-term approach with their game. At launch, the vanilla version of Crusader Kings 2 only had one playable religion available, which seems an odd choice considering how the focus of the game is on the politics between different historical nations. The scope of the game's world and the variety of its characters was also rather limited upon its release, and to top it off, it also suffered from poor optimization on many devices. But patience is always rewarded, and Paradox started pumping out one expansion after another, adding new playable factions, new religions to the world, new eras of history to dominate, and even new character portraits to help the various political figures stand apart from one another, in addition to improving the gameplay and UI. Now, with exponentially more content than it had at the start, Crusader Kings 2 has become the de facto strategy game for many fans, even after the release of Crusader Kings 3. Now that is staying power. Number 4. Destiny. Once you've developed some of the most beloved video games ever made, expectations are going to be a bit high for your next project. That's the situation Bungie found itself in following their work on the Halo series in the lead-up to their much-hyped new game, Destiny. Built on the ideas of a shared world and constantly evolving gameplay, Destiny was an ambitious project to say the least. At launch, things seemed alright for the most part, but players quickly ran into problems with unbalanced weapons and limited gameplay modes. Many complaints were also leveled at the game's story or lack thereof, and the presence of unfinished areas that players assumed were intended to be part of later paid DLC. Bungie, for their part, took responsibility for many of these issues, and having committed to supporting the game for at least 10 years, got to work making improvements. Destiny's first 2 years of content brought large-scale fixes to weapon balance and loot drops, as well as adjustments to character progression and the PvP modes. By the end of the game's third year, several large-scale expansions had been released in addition to regular free updates, with new story content and multiplayer raids. It took a while, but Destiny finally became the game it was always destined to be. Number 3. Tales of Symphonia twice. If I had a quid for every time Tales of Symphonia was released in a completely botched form, I'd have £2, which isn't a lot, I'll grant you, but it is weird that it happened twice, plus it's enough for a Greg's sausage roll, so there's that. When Tales of Symphonia was released on Steam, fans were chomping at the bit for a chance to experience the GameCube classic on modern hardware. Unfortunately for them, the game was a broken mess at launch, complete with a stuttering frame rate, low resolutions, and missing or broken text translations, and that's assuming you were lucky enough to even be able to get the game to launch. Thanks to a series of patches, the Steam version eventually reached a satisfactory state, so hopefully Bandai Namco learned their lesson for the next time they re-released the game, right? No, they did not. Tales of Symphonia Remastered was released for Switch and PlayStation 4 and somehow managed to be even worse than the Steam version, with utterly atrocious load times, broken visual effects, and enough slowdown in some areas to make the game practically unplayable. Despite broken promises from Bandai Namco, it took about 6 months before every version of the game was up to snuff. Fingers crossed they get it right the next time, but I won't hold my breath. Number 2. Street Fighter V. Street Fighter is one of the most influential video game series of all time, the trendsetter that every other fighting game strives to emulate. Let's just hope they don't try to emulate Street Fighter V. Following an 8-year wait after Street Fighter IV, anticipation was high for a sequel, but that anticipation dropped like a lead balloon when Street Fighter V actually launched. The roster was seen as uneven, lacking many of the series' most beloved characters, and online matches were mostly populated with unpleasant players due to the game lacking any means of punishing bad behavior. If you didn't want to play multiplayer, you were out of luck because there was no meaningful single-player content available either. Street Fighter V was a disaster that prompted public apologies from executives, yet somehow dug itself an even deeper grave with the additions of questionable monetization and a much maligned story mode that did little to assuage complaints. It wasn't until the game's third year, with many fixes to the gameplay mechanics and the addition of arcade mode, that opinions started to shift, a trend that continued with extra seasons of DLC. With how it managed to claw its way back to the top, Street Fighter V may just be one of the greatest comeback stories in fighting game history. Number 1. Final Fantasy XIV. So far on this list, we've talked about games that took some time and a lot of polish to reach their finished state, but there's only one game that was such a catastrophic failure that the developers had to erase it from existence. Final Fantasy XIV was the second main installment in the series to be an MMORPG, so you'd think Square Enix would know what they were doing. But on launch, the game was savaged by reviewers who tore into it for its gameplay, story, community features, interface, world, everything about the game, really. The backlash was so harsh that Square Enix even issued a public apology for the game, replaced the development team's leadership, and cancelled multiple ports before ultimately taking the whole thing offline after only 2 years. 1 year later, the game was relaunched as Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, a completely overhauled experience remade from the ground up. While the original game's storyline was still incorporated and existing players could transfer their characters over, it was for all intents and purposes an entirely new game, and a much better one at that. Square Enix used an aggressive strategy of free trials and offers to rebuild trust with fans, and with over 22 million active players as of today, it's fair to say that they succeeded.